It was a vastly different tone struck by Biden compared to his predecessor, asserting his country's re-engagement with the world, from rejoining the World Health Organization and the Paris Climate Change Accords to efforts to boost COVID vaccine supplies globally.
Instead of continuing to fight the wars of the past, we are fixing our eyes on devoting our resources to the challenges that hold the keys to our collective future. Ending this pandemic, addressing the climate crisis, managing the shifts in global power dynamics, shaping the rules of the world on vital issues like trade, cyber, and emerging technologies, and facing the threat of terrorism as it stands today. We've ended 20 years of conflict in Afghanistan, and as we close this period of relentless war, we're opening a new era of relentless diplomacy, of using the power of our development aid to invest in new ways of lifting people up around the world.
In an effort to affirm the tenets of democracy, he argued that governments by the people and for the people was still the best way to deliver for all the world's people. He indicated that US military power was a tool of last resort, warning that the world's most pressing issues could not be resolved through the force of arms, while urging the establishment of a global health threat council that was armed with tools to monitor and identify emerging pandemics so that the world was better primed to take immediate action.
And the commitment,
highlighting 3 pillars ahead of his COVID summit Wednesday: to save lives now, vaccinating the world, and building back better.
Bombs and bullets cannot defend against COVID-19 or its future variants. To fight this pandemic, we need a collective act of science and political will. We need to act now to get shots in arms as fast as possible and expand access to oxygen, tests, treatments to save lives around the world.
He also pressed countries to raise the ambitions of their nationally determined contributions ahead of the COP26 climate conference in Glasgow.
In April, I announced the United States will double our public international financing to help developing nations tackle the climate crisis. And today, I'm proud to announce that we'll work with the Congress to double that number again, including for adaptation efforts. This will make the United States a leader in public climate finance, and with our added support, together with increased private capital and from other donors, we'll be able to meet the goal of mobilizing $100 billion to support climate action in developing nations.
Earlier, the UN chief painted a bleak picture of a world on the precipice, from the pandemic and climate emergencies to upheaval in Afghanistan, Ethiopia and Yemen, as he pointed to vaccine inequity as a tale of global failure.
On the one hand, we see the vaccines developed in record time, a victory of science and human ingenuity. On the other hand, we see that triumph undone by the tragedy of lack of political will, selfishness and mistrust. A surplus in some countries, empty shelves in others. A majority of the wealthier world vaccinated, over 90% of Africans still waiting for the first dose. This is a moral indictment of the state of our world. It is an obscenity.
He urged bridging action on 6 great divides: peace and stability, gaps in climate ambition, growing divides between rich and poor, gender equity, digital access, and among generations.
Thank you.
As the UN seeks to elevate the role of youth in resolving global challenges. Sherwin Bryce-Pease, SABC News, New York.
For more on this, we're joined by Sherwin live from New York. Great to have you with us as always, Sherwin. A first for Biden, and what a different tone from his predecessor in the General Assembly today. What more did he touch on in his remarks?
I will also say, Francis, that the members of the General Assembly didn't break out in laughter when President Biden was addressing them today. And you correctly point out that this was a different speech from a different president. I mean, he talked about, this being an inflection point in history, that the United States administration wants to lead the world towards a more prosperous future for all people. And, that is sort of a counterpoint to what we heard from his predecessor, Donald Trump, that very much focused on the America First principle or ideology that certainly espoused his 4 years in the White House. Biden talking about ending the pandemic, highlighting the climate emergency, very much concerned about issues of terrorism and geopolitical instability around the world. He touched on Afghanistan, saying that, they were moving into an era of ending relentless wars, rather, and moving into a new era of relentless diplomacy to replace that era of relentless wars. He talked about our own success being bound up in others succeeding as well. And that, I think, is a principle that we are not really seeing itself play out in terms of the COVID-19 vaccine inequity response. Of course, President Biden convening a COVID vaccine summit that will be held virtually, in part here at the United Nations. We understand that he will be returning to Washington soon, but really talking about how the collective unified approach, reinvesting in multilateral fora, talking about rejoining the WHO, the Paris Climate Change Agreement, and such endeavors, talking about re-engaging with Iran to return to the Iran nuclear deal known as the JCPOA, and how the United States will then renew its commitments to that deal if Iran follows suit. So very much a different tone here from President Biden, if we were, of course, now to compare him to former President Donald Trump, Francis.
So, Sherwin, before we look at what the Secretary General said, I mean, what has the reaction been to Biden's speech? I see some people have been talking about the close proximity to that messy withdrawal from Afghanistan, maybe denting his authority somewhat. Just tell me about the reaction.
Well, the three pillars on which the U.S. administration has built their visit here to UN headquarters for High-Level Week on Hunger is ending the pandemic. It's about getting vaccines, shots into arms, and then very much a focus on talking about democracy and human rights. He talked a lot about authoritarianism on the rise and how the United States is seeking to counter that in places like, he mentioned Belarus, Venezuela, Cuba. Of course, different countries have different positions on those human rights concerns, but the United States very vociferous in its criticism of this rise in authoritarianism and how they plan to counteract that. Oxfam, the global movement to tackle injustice and poverty, releasing a statement a short time ago, Francis, saying that President Biden recommitted the United States to a policy of principled internationalism, a hallmark of American foreign policy in years past. His rhetoric rekindled the possibility, they write, and hope that nations can work together to solve the problems that they cannot solve alone. But without bold action to back up this vision, his words may ring hollow for many around the world. So his biggest test now, given that statement from Oxfam, is going to be whether they can deliver real change in terms of the international global response to helping poorer nations. When we talk about only 2% of Africans having access to vaccines to date, that really is going to be the big test here. What can this president deliver, given certainly the road they're seeking to lead here in terms of vaccine equity around the world, Francis?
All right, then the Secretary General focusing on 6 great divides that he's urged member states to bridge in the years ahead. And a powerful speech. He spoke for the most vulnerable in our societies.
I'll read you just these two highlighted quotes from his very lengthy statement, Francis. He says, quote, "We passed the science test, but we are getting an F in ethics. The climate alarm bells are also ringing at fever pitch, scorching temperatures, shocking biodiversity loss, polluted air, water, and natural spaces." So 2 very important pillars for the Secretary General is how is the world going to deal with the inequities we're seeing in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic response, and then, of course, the burning issue, excuse my word, but it's absolutely pertinent, the burning issue of a burning planet and what the world is going to do. Will countries like South Africa, like middle-income countries around the world, developing nations in the main, what are their nationally determined contributions going to look like when they go to Glasgow, the COP26 climate summit in Glasgow, Scotland later this year? We are just a few weeks away from that. And the urgency that the Secretary General is talking about what is required from nations around the world. He also addressed this notion, this idea about common but differentiated responsibilities. You hear this a lot from developing countries when they talk about what is expected of the developing world, this $100 billion annually that the developed world is promised to assist developing countries in mitigation efforts as it pertains to climate change. We are now at this pivotal point where if countries do not deliver on the roadmap towards zero emissions by 2050, a roadmap to reducing their fossil fuel usage and reducing their dependence on coal-powered stations, if that does not happen at Glasgow, we are going to fall off the edge of the earth, as it were. And so this is a very pressing moment for the Secretary General, just given that we're weeks away from this critical climate summit in Glasgow.
Wow, so failing in ethics, facing the abyss. Let's see if the warnings are heeded. Thank you very much, Sherwin Bryce-Pease, reporting live from the US.